Hello everyone, my name is Preston Dennett and thank you for joining me for a new episode of UFOs and the Paranormal. Hope you're all doing well. I've got a pretty exciting episode for you today, I think. I am of course going to be exploring some more humanoid cases. 10 humanoid cases in fact. I call this episode I Played Dead and 9 other truly terrifying humanoid encounters. That is a very common theme. A humanoid encounter is often very scary for people, which is completely understandable. The 10 cases I've chosen for you today do come from all over the world. I've got 5 cases from outside of the United States and 5 cases in the United States. And the locations in this episode include Estonia, France, Italy, Spain, Australia, Alaska, Michigan, Nebraska, New Mexico, and Oregon. These cases do stretch over a long period of time, all the way back to 1930, well before the modern age of UFOs, up to 2017. So we're just going to take a little journey through time and space and explore various humanoid encounters. Quite a different variety of humanoids in this episode, as we will see. So let's just get started. And the first case I'd like to talk about, I call SOCK-SNATCHING ETs. That's right, ETs that are stealing someone's socks. This occurred way back in August 1930 in a little town, Montebenichi, Italy. And this case was unknown for a very long period of time. But it's super interesting because, again, it's a very early case, well before humanoids were being really researched at all. Also, it has some remarkable parallels to another case which occurred very close to this one. I think you'll find it a pretty fascinating case. This very early case was covered by multiple Italian researchers such as Edoardo Lavacci, Bruno Mancusi, Massimo Beneducci, Figlin Valdarno, Solas Boncompagni, Robert Ricci, and others. It occurred one beautiful early morning in August 1930 in the very small mountain town of Montebenichi. This is near Arezzo, Italy. The witness is anonymous. I'll call her Sophia. We're not sure how old she was. Some sources say she was quite young, 16 years old, while others say she was in her 40s. At any rate, she had gone to the Ambrella stream. This is a tributary of the much larger Ambra River. And she was doing her laundry. This is something she had done many times, and she had just finished washing 2 pairs of hand-knitted wool socks and hung them on a clothesline that she had set up to allow her clothes to dry. And at that moment, she heard an unusual noise. I'll just quote her directly. As she says, "I suddenly heard a hissing sound in the air, and at the same time, I felt a gust of wind from behind. For a moment, I thought the weather had suddenly changed. But when I looked over my shoulder, I froze with terror. Just 20 steps from me stood a strange and shimmering structure which looked like a big top with the tip up." So this was a weird craft which she estimated was about 15 to 18 feet in diameter. The strangest part, however, was yet to come. She moved cautiously towards it, but stopped when an opening appeared on the bottom of the object, which she said was like a trap door. Immediately, a small ladder emerged from this opening, and as Sophia says, 2 little men came out of the lower part at that time and spoke in a way that seemed to be a tweet. Now, per Sophia, these little men were around 3 feet tall. She didn't really describe exactly what they looked like, but she said they walked around her several times, making bird-like chirping sounds, and at one point actually touched her. During this time, she was immobilized with fear, but the encounter came to a quick end when the humanoids apparently achieved the purpose for their visit. As Sophia says, "Then they took the still damp laundry off the clothesline and went up into their top. They took my stockings off the wire and took them inside the top. They had barely entered. It was whistling again so strangely, and as another gust of wind struck me, the strange top rose incredibly fast, disappearing a few moments later. It went up vertically in an instant, and I did not see anything anymore." So unfortunately, no description of the humanoids was provided, but Sophia was impressed enough to immediately tell others about what had happened to her. As she says, as if driven by fury, I went back to our village and told about my unusual experience. Everyone laughed at me. Nobody wanted to believe me. I was very angry about it, and I'm still angry today, because I had seen everything with my own eyes. Now, researchers also interviewed other people in the area much later who confirmed that Sophia had in fact shared the incident with other villagers. And in fact, it became the talk of the town for some time and did eventually appear in newspapers. Interestingly, in 1954, years later, and only a few kilometers away in Sannina, Italy, another case of SOCK-SNATCHING ETs, and they also stole flowers, this would gain wide publicity. In that case, a lady by the name of Rosa Latti described this very similar incident. How bizarre is that? I mean, really, why would ETs come, land, and steal a person's socks? It's funny, it reminds me of an episode of Married with Children where Al Bundy had an encounter, and what were the ETs doing? Stealing his socks. So maybe there's something going on here. I don't know. It's a very odd case, but certainly not unique. Now here's another one which is quite interesting. I call this one The Little Men in the Clover Field. This is another pretty early case, summer of 1950. This occurred in Lidovír, Estonia. And at this time, few UFO researchers were taking humanoid cases seriously. Certainly not in the United States. People were studying sightings, but any cases involving humanoids were pretty much disregarded. That was about to change because this is when humanoid encounters really started becoming a lot more numerous. This one is a single witness case, but it's certainly, I think, an important one. This brief but fascinating case comes from UFO researchers Tun Kelan and Juri Lina and was published in the volume 24, number 1 issue of the Flying Saucer Review. There is just one witness, a 6-year-old anonymous girl. I'll call her Olivia, but she was interviewed firsthand by the investigators. Reportedly, it was a beautiful summer day in 1950 as Olivia was outside her family's farmhouse in Lidovír Oja, Estonia. This is a very small rural village just south of Šurjani. On that day, Olivia had a sudden impulse to go outside. As she sat in a clover field surrounded by forest, she noticed a cigar-shaped object about 6 meters long, that's almost 20 feet, sitting in the field about 300 to 400 meters from her home. So this is not far away, about 1/5 of a mile. She said it was black in color, except for the ends, which were a sort of silver-gray color. Now she thought at first that it might be an airplane, but it had no wings, no wheels, and in the center of the craft there was a large rectangular door. But most strange was that there were 4 men moving around near the object, or what looked like men. They were quite small. They were about her size, just under 4 feet tall. She said their skin complexion was very red, and they were wearing bright green clothes with a hood over their heads. Their eyes also looked very strange and seemed to be almost immobile, is how she described it. She said they were moving very awkwardly around their craft. She saw one of the little men actually raise his foot and kick the side of this craft. Then 2 of the men approached within just a few feet of her. When they did this, Olivia spoke to the men out loud and using gestures, and she said that they did answer her, though she cannot remember any of the contents of their conversation other than to say that it was not audible, it was telepathic. During this conversation, she realized that these little men were not normal humans. And this is when she became seized by a sudden fear and ran directly home. Looking back, she saw this object take off slowly, very smoothly and silently. She told both her mother and her grandmother, but neither of them believed her story. The next day, she did return to the location of the landing, but admitted that it took her a very long time, as she was still very much frightened by the encounter. At the time, she had never seen a plane, And when she did, sometime later, she was amazed to see that they did have wings. So this was clearly not a plane or any normal conventional vehicle as we would think of it. Pretty weird, and I would imagine quite scary for the witness. It's this weird pattern we have of UFOs landing, ETs coming out and approaching people and then going right back into their craft. It's not entirely clear why this is happening. Could this be a display? Are ETs conducting some sort of study? You can make up your own minds about it, but this is a pattern that is really quite prominent in these humanoid cases. Now here's another case which is very unusual. This one is a multiple witness case. Most of the cases in this particular episode are multiple witness cases, 7 out of 10. That's important because you can call one person a liar, but if you start calling multiple people a liar, that, starts to become problematic. And it's clear to me that these cases cannot be explained away as hoaxes or frankly, hallucinations, misperceptions, and mental illness, despite what our governments would have us believe. No, there's too many cases of these kinds. This one I call They Looked Human. This took place in the summer of 1956 in Marseille, France. And it's a fascinating case because the witnesses in this case did not jump to the explanation that these were extraterrestrials from outer space. This case comes from French researcher Jean-Pierre Trodeck and first appeared in the French magazine Lumière dans la nuit, that is, Lights in the Night, and this is the issue number 154. In fact, it was pure synchronicity that Jean-Pierre, the investigator, was able to research this case as he only heard about it from a friend who had walked into a bookstore looking for a book on UFOs when the shopkeeper, Mademoiselle X, said she had no books on UFOs, but said that she had already seen them. So she's the witness. We don't know her name. And after getting some of the details of her story, Jean-Pierre's friend contacted him, and Jean-Pierre contacted Mademoiselle X, who shared her experience only after much convincing. Her previous experience with sharing her story with others had resulted in ridicule and then in unwanted publicity. So she was initially very reluctant to speak about it. But thankfully Jean-Pierre was able to get her to reveal the details of her remarkable encounter. And as he says, her story seems and appears to be highly credible, and she seems to me very balanced and very erudite. Now it was a summer afternoon in 1956 as Mademoiselle X, her husband, and 2 friends were driving along a small remote road outside of Marseille. Mademoiselle X and her husband were in the front seat and their friends were in the back. And coming around a corner in the road, they came almost face to face with a strange craft on the right side of the road, only about 30 feet, 10 meters away. It was hovering about 3 to 6 feet off the ground and was perfectly motionless. The witnesses immediately stopped the car and exited to get a better look. None of them felt any fear and were instead very much fascinated by what they were looking at. They estimate that this craft was about 30 feet wide and 10 feet high. They said it was metallic gray and had a classic flying saucer shape, like 2 plates overturned on top of each other. There were no visible markings on the craft, but there was a window, or perhaps a row of windows, around the edge of the craft. It was through these windows that all 4 witnesses saw what they described as 3 human-looking figures watching them. These humanoids, these human-looking figures, were visible only from the shoulders up, but they did appear to be watching the witnesses attentively, like curious visitors to a zoo, is how Mademoiselle X described it. They wore uniforms, but again, appeared to be normal humans. One thing was clear to the witnesses. The UFO occupants seemed to be very interested in the 4 humans watching them. After just a few moments, the craft suddenly took off at high speed in a climbing curve up into the sky, disappearing in only about 5 seconds. It made no sound or no wind. Mademoiselle X does not claim that the human-looking beings were extraterrestrial. In fact, she speculated that they might be from another country here on Earth, though she did say that she was very much impressed by the speed and mobility of the craft. A pretty unusual case, and one of the few, if not the only one, in this compilation where the witnesses did not react in fear. Perhaps because these ETs did look human, and perhaps they were. It's entirely possible that this was a reverse-engineered craft. But that begs the question, what the heck are these humans, if that's what they were, showing themselves to people along the side of a road and just kind of staring at them? I don't know. There's always so many questions to all of these cases. So let's move to the next one. I call this next one, I Played Dead. This is the title of this episode, and so this is sort of the cover story, if you will, of this episode. This one really, I thought, was quite profound and clearly scary for the witnesses. This took place in June of 1957 in Birmingham, Michigan. This is a multiple witness case, and it's very unusual. This case was reported to the National UFO Reporting Center, New Fork, and involves three brothers by the name of James, Mickey, and Tim. Those are their real names, though they do not use their last name. At the time of their encounter, they lived on Dorchester Street in Birmingham. This is a suburb of Detroit, Michigan. You can see it here. The report comes from James, who at the time of this incident was about 6 years old. His brother Mickey was 5 years old, and their brother Tim was just a toddler in his crib. All of them shared a room, and it was one evening in 1957, June, when James woke up to what would be the scariest moment in his life up to even today. As James says, I was awakened by the sound of muffled, panicked cries coming from the other side of my bedroom. It was my brother Mickey. I became immediately and fully terrified. I was facing the wall away from him, and I knew there was no way I would look in his direction because I knew something or someone was in the room. And from the disturbing intensity of Mickey's whimpering noises, I knew it was not Santa Claus. I did not move a muscle or make a sound, hoping that whatever it was would not know I was there. So I literally played dead, as I desperately did not want the boogeyman to know I even existed. My heart was pounding in my ears from fear, and my fears were not unfounded, as the next thing I hear was, "Look out, Jimmy." So this was his brother Mickey warning him. About what, James did not know, but he knew it couldn't be good, and his fear escalated exponentially. As James says, I thought, "Oh no, he just told it I'm here." Those words sent me crashing into a terror that in a few moments would increase 1,000-fold. I was lying on my stomach, and suddenly there was a long-fingered claw or hand planted firmly in the middle of my back and spine. Now at the time, James of course had never heard of aliens. He had no idea how to interpret the experience or who or what was in his room touching his back. He wondered, was it the claw of a witch? Was it an evil monster? He really had no idea. All he knew was that he was deeply afraid. In fact, he thought he was about to be killed. As James says, I was going to die for sure. I'm not kidding. This was the most frightening night of my life. Suddenly, I realized there was tremendous heat. So much so, I could feel the heat coming clear through my body, through my chest and solar plexus area, and onto the bed lying beneath me. I thought, without a doubt, in my little boy's brain, I was being stabbed to death with a knife, as I felt the knife slowly corkscrew deep into my body. I never flinched or made a noise. That was my brave but useless way of hoping it might think I was already dead. Now as this was going on, James could hear a, quote, deafening hissing noise, which was in his head, which he assumed must be the sound of the monster's breathing. And as James says, this only intensified my terror. During these moments, I was unable to appreciate the fact that it was actually not painful. What I felt was more of a thick bluntness turning its way into me. Not long afterward, I felt the knife come back out of me. I was shocked that I was still alive, though I did not want the invader to know that. Then the heat stopped, and its hand was removed from my back. Now at this point, James did not visibly react. He stayed perfectly still and silent, eyes closed, still playing dead. In fact, he remained that way until the sun came up the next morning. Now he's not sure if he told his parents or not, but he guesses that he probably did, and that they told him he had just had a nightmare. But of course, James is 100% sure that this was not a dream or a nightmare. As he says, "I knew it happened, and I was not sleeping. It was not a dream. I never for a moment forgot this experience, as it was clearly drilled into my memory. For several days to a week, I snuck a knife from the kitchen that I was not supposed to have and hid it under my pillow. It was the only defense I could think of. But my mother soon found it and took it away. As life went on, growing up, I never discussed it at all with my brother Mickey. And as an adult, I totally assumed that he would not remember that night. I was wrong." So it was 37 years after the incident. In 1994, James was sitting with his wife and some friends, swapping various experiences that they had had with ghosts and the paranormal. So James decided to share his story of the monster in his room. Then afterwards, one of his friends asked if his brother Mickey had ever mentioned the story, and James said, quote, "No, I am sure he won't remember anything." But then he thought to himself, why not just ask him? So he went to the phone and called up his brother, and he started to say, "Do you remember a night back on Dorchester?" And he got no further than that when Mickey interrupted him and immediately began to talk about the scary encounter. As Mickey says, "I woke up to find what I thought was Casper the ghost floating over to the side of my bed. It was peering down into my face with its hands held up in front and just above me. It had a big head and big black eyes. I was completely terrified and totally freaking out. It just kept looking down at me. I was frantically crying when it finally moved away from me and went over to the crib that held Tim. And it raised its hand over the crib opening and its hand lit up. Then it moved away from the crib and I saw it go over to you. I tried to warn you and I said, 'Look out, Jimmy.' It bent all the way down over you and looked like it was touching you." So Mickey is describing this to his brother James. And hearing this, James felt as if he was about to faint. James at this point shared his side of the story, and then Mickey added some new details. He recalled that after the experience, he would wake up night after night shrieking from terrifying nightmares about this incident. And in fact, he refused to go to sleep unless the lights were on. He said that their parents finally took him to a doctor and had his brain x-rayed to find out if anything was wrong. Now, hearing Mickey's side of the story, this changed how James felt about his experience, and it really connected the dots for him involving other strange encounters in his life. As James says, "I am sure now that Casper, the big-head, big black-eyed ghost, was a visiting gray alien. What I am unsure of is what did it do to me. I figured that it either fixed something in me, or took DNA, or left an implant, or all of the above. I don't know any of that for sure, but I have since had several uniquely close experiences with UFOs that occurred later in my adult life that led me to believe we are connected somehow for some purpose that I hope to understand perhaps sometime in the future. This is indeed a fascinating universe we journey upon." It seems like there are a lot of witnesses who are young children. Not sure why that is, other than perhaps contact often does start at a very young age, but it's certainly a prominent pattern we see in humanoid encounters. Another pattern that's certainly present in this case is that the children were not believed. Luckily, they did have each other, but they still kept this encounter pretty much a secret for most of their lives. So luckily they did have someone to corroborate their story. And as you can see, it was very scary for them and did affect them really profoundly. That's also a very prominent pattern. So now let's move to the next case. This one I thought was really interesting because it's got some unusual elements to it that are perhaps not unique, but certainly not super common, because this one involves a lot of witnesses, but apparently only one really remembers this in any detail. I call this one Never Tell This Story. This occurred one evening in October 1968 in Morgan Springs. This is in the Malheur Forest of Oregon. And yeah, this one is unusual to say the least. This case comes secondhand from the aunt of the main witness, as her aunt never wanted to report it. The niece finally decided to reveal the details in the hopes that it might be corroborated by other people in the area. This case involves a large extended family and their friends who, one evening in October of 1968, this is approximate, were camping in the rugged country wilderness at Morgan Springs in the Malheur National Forest. This is north of Burns, Oregon. By the way, malheur is a French word meaning misfortune or adversity, which is a curious name for a forest, especially considering what happened next. According to the niece, the main witness, her aunt was the national chairperson of a prestigious real estate concern and was actually listed in Who's Who. She was, as her niece says, quote, very successful, logical, and level-headed. I'll call the niece Alice. That is, of course, a pseudonym. The experience began around 7 p.m. one evening in October of 1968 as the aunt was walking around the group with a tray of snacks, offering them to everyone, and this is when a large, saucer-shaped craft appeared overhead. As Alice says, talking about her aunt, she stated that it soundlessly glided into view just above the treetops, large ponderosa pines. It stopped hovering, not directly overhead, about 50 feet away, about 100 feet above the ground. About half of the craft was visible. It was saucer-shaped. She estimated it to be at least 100 feet wide. Everyone freaked out. Women screamed, men yelled, some went for their hunting rifles. She said it was so close and so obvious what it was that nobody said anything like, "What is it?" Everyone knew. There were windows. She said they appeared after it stopped to hover. A yellow light was visible, apparently emanating from the craft's interior. She said the shapes of more than one humanoid was visible, and movement was easily discerned with the yellow backlight. No features were seen, as no light was directed into the craft from the outside. She said the movements were fluid, natural, but seemed uncharacteristic of human movement. The proportions were odd as well. She said they seemed curious about them, moving to get different looks into the campsite. Now at this point, only a few seconds had elapsed. The aunt was a camera buff, and wanting to capture a photograph of this flying saucer, she dropped the tray of snacks on the ground and ran to the camping vehicle to retrieve her 35mm camera. She grabbed the camera and quickly loaded it with film. She says it took her no more than 3 minutes, but when she ran back outside with the camera, she was confronted by an incredible sight. As Alice says, the entire group was still and calm. The craft had gone. Some of those that hadn't left the fire area were again seated. A couple of the group that ran were slowly walking back. 2 men with hunting rifles were stone still and seemed catatonic for another couple of minutes. So the aunt was understandably astonished and really puzzled by the way everyone was reacting, or lack of reacting, and she started asking everyone what happened. Where did the saucer go? Everyone seemed dazed or entranced, and only slowly did they regain their wits. And when the aunt began asking about the UFO and explained her memory of it, nobody remembered it at all. As Alice says, she was frantic, demanding answers. They all, including her husband, acted like she'd lost her mind. They had no explanation or memory of why some were away from the fire holding guns, or unable to recall the tray of snacks being dropped by her as she ran for her camera. She was incredulous, and being a strong-willed, confident woman, she demanded answers and insisted her story was true and that it was they who were daft. It got heated. Her husband, my uncle, finally felt embarrassed enough to demand her silence. In the coming days, she agreed, at his request, to never tell this story. To my knowledge, I am the only one she told. Alice's aunt speculated that the reason she was able to remember when no one else could was because she was in the camper and was perhaps protected by the metal skin of the camper. Alice calls her uncle and aunt, quote, the greatest people I've ever known. She is absolutely convinced that her aunt is telling the truth, and as she says, I need no additional proof. I simply believe her. Hopefully, if any other events took place in that area, this will add weight to their accounts. Very strange. It's hard to say why only one witness really recalled seeing the humanoids, and how difficult that must have been for her to talk about this in front of people who were there, but called her crazy, said it didn't happen. She stuck to her guns and says that, yes, this did happen. And yeah, we see that. It's not unusual for there to be sort of a selective amnesia where some people remember and others don't. But to be the only one in a crowd of people, that's got to be tremendously stressful. And I can see why the witness said, never tell this story. The vast majority of people do keep these kinds of experiences secret. That's one of the reasons I do this research and put out these episodes, so that we can move past that and that people will feel more comfortable sharing their stories. Also, to remove the fear factor, because one of the best ways to remove fear is to make the unknown known. So that's what I'm trying to do here. Now let's move to the next case. This one is pretty unusual. One of you listeners out there requested that I find a case involving sort of flying humanoids. I've presented a number of them before, but here's another. I call this one the jetpack humanoid. This one occurred in 1974, one evening around dusk, just outside of Melbourne, Australia, on a dairy farm. This one is also a multiple witness case and a pretty unusually described humanoid. This case comes from the National UFO Reporting Center and was reported by the brother of the witness. The witness is anonymous, so I'll give him the pseudonym Phil. It was around dusk one day in 1974 that Phil, age 5, was outside on the family's dairy farm, which was located southeast of Melbourne in Victoria, Australia. He was playing near the gate of their property. His father and grandfather were in the barn finishing up milking the cows, and his grandmother was standing in the doorway of the farmhouse. And this is when something strange happened. According to Phil, he suddenly noticed what he described as, quote, a big bright star. This was clearly not a star, as it appeared to be hovering between their farm and the neighbor's property, approximately 200 meters away, 600 feet. So he watched as the glowing object began to abruptly dart around in various positions in the western sky before hovering in place for some time. It then began to move closer, and this is when Phil could see that it was actually a solid object hovering about 50 meters away from him. And as Phil says, it was a metal machine, a shiny spaceship, a flying saucer like the flying saucers you see. What happened next was vividly engraved on his memory. He said a, quote, hatch, like a gangplank, opened up on the side of the object, and a, quote, spaceman with a jetpack flew out. Phil watched in amazement as this spaceman proceeded to perform various maneuvers in the sky, occasionally coming close and then flying off at a distance. Finally, the spaceman approached Phil and landed on the dirt road near the gate, about 30 meters, less than 100 feet, away from him. Phil was terrified and turned to run, but found that he was totally immobilized, frozen to the spot. As he said, "You can't run. Even if you want to, you can't run." Meanwhile, Phil's grandmother, who was standing about 10 meters away, also apparently saw the humanoid. Phil's brother was unable to get much more detail about this encounter from his brother, but presumably at this point, the UFO occupant flew back up into the craft, re-entered it, and the craft took off. Phil immediately told everyone in the family, and his grandmother allegedly confirmed this story, though she would later refuse to talk about it, and when pressed, she actually denied the whole thing. Again, it was Phil's brother who reported the incident to Newfork, and as he wrote, "What intrigues me to this day is that as long as I can remember, the story has remained consistent among our family. What has always fascinated me about his story is that he made my parents and grandparents aware of the sighting at the time, and it has been mentioned intermittently, albeit with embarrassment and disbelief by the adults, ever since. In other words, he reported what he saw to them at the time and in detail. So this is not some false memory of childhood, recalled or invented many years later. Recently I broached the subject with him to get a definitive account of what I believe is a genuine UFO occupant encounter." Very weird. There are a huge number of cases with UFOs and ETs showing an interest in farms. That does seem to be a draw for them, a target. Not exactly sure why. Perhaps there's something else about this area that is attracting the ETs. Hard to say for sure, but who knows? The more cases we have, the more knowledge we have about what's going on here. So let's just keep adding to the database, and perhaps one day we'll have answers to all of these questions. So now let's move to the next case. I call this one 4 Apes and a UFO. This occurred one evening, February 21st, 1982, at a campground in Gorliz, Spain. This is another multiple witness case. I thought this one was particularly compelling, not only because it's got multiple witnesses, but because the description of the humanoids is very unusual. This case was investigated by researcher J.J. Benitez. It appeared in newspapers and in a couple of books. It was 15 minutes to midnight on August 25, 1979, when two friends, Fermina Teniente and Maria de Los Angeles Camin, both aged 35, were camping at the Gorliz Municipal Campsite in Vizcaya, Spain. They were sitting outside the entrance to their little camping hut. A small stream was nearby, and looking at some bushes near the stream, this is when they noticed the silhouette of what looked to them at first like an animal squatting down near the ground, only about 6 feet away from them. Fermina immediately turned to her friend Maria and said, "Look, what a strange dog." But then suddenly it stood up and looked at them, and they saw that it wasn't a dog. It was actually a humanoid figure about 4.5 to 5 feet tall. Its face, they said, radiated kindness. So at this point they felt no fear. They did try to shine their flashlight at it, but strangely their flashlight would not work. The figure then began to walk with long strides. In the darkness, they weren't sure if it had thick, dark fur or skin, or if it was wearing blackish clothing that was somehow reflecting in the moonlight. But they did see that its arms were long enough that they touched the ground. This figure was not normal. The way it walked was very unusual, with this sort of hunched posture. And as it walked past their tent, they wondered if perhaps it was some kind of an ape that had perhaps escaped from the zoo or a circus. They could see that it had an oval skull with what looked like abundant hair flattened and swept back. They could see no mouth, no ears, only 2 immense rounded eyes and a very large mouth, eyes much, much bigger than a human. It strode quickly past their tent, descended a steep slope, and disappeared from view. Both women were shocked and were trying to calm down when suddenly, emerging from the same place where the first one had appeared, 3 identical, strange, ape-like humanoids appeared. These 3 were walking much faster than the first, but instead of following the first, they climbed a hill and disappeared in the opposite direction. Now this did cause the women to become afraid. The witnesses were very much impressed by their large eyes. Seeing these three creatures, both Fermina and Maria screamed and actually burst into tears, waking up many of the campers around them, all of who rushed outside to see what was happening. The witnesses explained what they had seen and pointed to the location, and the other campers could see a trail of footprints leading up in the direction where the woman had seen these humanoids walk off into the darkness. Now this caused an uproar at the campground, especially because just a short time later, an intense glowing light moved silently overhead, so bright it illuminated the entire area. This very much alarmed the frightened crowd of campers, who now began to wonder if the unidentified glowing object was in fact the vehicle used by the strange humanoids they had seen just a few hours earlier. While it is pure speculation, it does look like that UFO sighting is in some way related to the humanoid encounter that occurred just before it. Certainly that's what the witnesses thought. But how unusual are those humanoids? Certainly not your standard greys by any means. I'm not sure I'd call these Bigfoot, because they certainly weren't very tall, but they did have sort of an ape-like appearance. The variety of humanoids is astonishing. But once again, they're almost entirely humanoid in form, which I think is very significant and has profound implications, and I think shows once again, and I've said this before, that our relationship to these guys is probably closer than we think. In fact, some do look entirely human. Really, really interesting. I know I keep saying these accounts are interesting and fascinating, but they are. They've got so much to teach us. So now let's move to another case, which was again truly terrifying for the witness. This is a single witness case, but I think it's an important case. It's got some really unusual elements to it in terms of how this encounter affected the environment around the witness. I call this one My Heart Was Pounding. This took place on November 2nd, 1997 in Anchorage, Alaska. It's not a super big town. It definitely does have quite a bit of activity though, and this encounter is a really interesting humanoid experience. It was about 1 a.m. on the night of November 2nd, 1997 that Brett, that is a pseudonym, was in his basement bedroom in his home in Anchorage, Alaska. He had an interview planned for the next morning, but found himself unable to sleep. He was sleeping on a queen-sized box spring mattress on a concrete floor, and there was a toaster sitting on the floor about 2 feet away from his head. This detail is important considering what happened next. As Brett says, "As I lay there, I suddenly became aware that there was someone else in the room, but it felt like they had stepped into my mind and were observing. At this point, I tried to move so I could see it. I could not move. As I struggled to move, the coils in the toaster began vibrating. And the harder I struggled, the coils in the toaster would vibrate at a higher pitch. Finally, using a great effort of willpower, Brett was able to break free from the paralysis, and in one smooth motion, he grabbed his loaded Colt pistol with his left hand and sat up in bed. To his shock, he saw a, quote, light brighter than the sun just outside his basement door. But very quickly, this light moved away from the bedroom, took a left turn up the stairs, and went through the glass window in the stairwell. At that point, he glanced behind him and saw a second intensely bright light move up and away from the window well. He couldn't see the source of the light, but it was clear to him that whatever it was, they were retreating. So he sat up in bed and remained vigilant for a half hour before finally laying back down, but this time placing his pistol under his pillow. It was just a half hour later, at about 2 a.m., that the strange visitors returned, and as Brett says, I felt the same presence in my mind. This time I laughed out loud because I knew who it was, and I thought it would be easy enough to break free as I did earlier. I struggled to move, but this time they were immobilizing me with a higher frequency, and the coils in the toaster were vibrating at a very high pitch. But I was determined to at least see what or who was doing this, and finally I was able to move my head enough to see a gray alien partially phased through the ceiling tiles staring at me. The room was dimly lit, but enough for a good look. After a quick look, the room went dark and it disappeared. Now, Brett feels pretty certain that this was a gray alien who was trying to take him that night. As he says, "I was almost abducted by a gray alien. I have to believe it let me move to look at it, as they were prepared for me the second time." To me, the most interesting aspect of that encounter is how the toaster seemed to sort of vibrate along with the buzzing sound or whatever was going on with this encounter. I also found it interesting that the witness felt that the ETs allowed him to see them. A number of witnesses do say this. So I don't know what to make of that other than that ETs do want us to know that they are there or are contacting us. But it was a pretty scary experience for him, as you can see. So now let's move to another case that was truly terrifying. I call this one, "It Froze Me in Fear." This one occurred on the evening of November 9, 2010, outside of Omaha, Nebraska. This is a multiple witness case. What's interesting to me about this case is the description of the humanoid. And once again, it affected the witness profoundly in a way that really changed him for the rest of his life. This case involves an anonymous married couple who reported their encounter about 10 years after it occurred, with the husband providing his first-hand testimony of a truly fascinating encounter with an unusual humanoid. I'll call him Wyatt, that's a pseudonym. He says it was 1:11 a.m. on November 9, 2010, as he and his wife were taking an evening stroll into a wooded grove near their home. Now, this is something they had done many times, and they knew the area quite well. There were a few houses off in the distance whose lights were visible through the trees, and this is when they noticed shadows of figures darting through the trees. Even though it was quite late, they assumed that there must be children playing in the woods at night. So they decided to get a closer look and perhaps scare the children as a kind of practical joke. Little did they know, they would be the ones who would receive a scare. As Wyatt says, "We got close to the trees and realized there were no children in the grove. No one could be seen at all. The grove was well lit, as there was a lot of moonlight and virtually no leaves left on the trees. As we walked holding hands into the grove, we abruptly heard a footfall in the leaves. At that time, the unknown entity crossed our path. It moved in glimpses, as if under a strobe light, only no light was given off. As it crossed our path, it was visible one moment, then gone the next. This alternated as it strode in front of us. It smiled at us and appeared to be waving. I wasn't prepared for this, and seeing it froze me in fear. The entity was a biped that stood taller than me at 5 feet 10 inches. It was completely naked, though no genitalia could be seen, as you would imagine a doll would look. The skin was a dark grayish color. It had very small black eyes which reflected the moonlight. Its ears were tight against its head and came to a point. The jaw was bigger than any human's. The jawline went all the way up the sides of its head, as if its smile started behind its ears almost. Rows of sharp white teeth were visible as it smiled at us. It had slits for a nose, and they were slightly flared at the top. I can't remember how many fingers it had, but it definitely had digits that it held up as it waved at us. Now, this encounter was very brief, only a few minutes at most, but seeing how unusual the entity was, Wyatt, who was very athletic and about twice the size of his wife, grabbed his wife by the wrist and ran away as fast as he could, practically dragging her out of the grove of trees to an open soccer field near their home and to the safety of the street. His wife immediately started screaming and saying, go back," and explained to him that she wanted to make contact with this entity. But Kyle was too afraid and insisted they return to the house, which they did. Reaching the house, they stood in the doorway looking at the grove. With the entity apparently gone, They decided to separate themselves and write down independently what they had just experienced, and when they compared the details, they of course matched perfectly. But for Kyle, this encounter was particularly traumatic. As Kyle says, "This event has affected my life very negatively. My family thinks my wife and I made it up, or are just plain lying to get their attention. For a long time, I never told anyone but my closest friends and my immediate family for fear that people would think we were crazy. But it's come to a point that this itch in the back of my brain has gotten so bad, I feel it necessary to tell others of what we saw. I've become so obsessed with searching the web for possible information on the existence of alien life that I often spend hours of my time sifting through garbage on the internet just to find someone, somewhere, who has seen an entity like the one I saw. Not knowing what this entity was keeps me up many nights. I have thought about every feasible possibility: a spirit, a human in a Hollywood-style movie makeup, a hologram projector, or even an alien. To this day, not knowing eats at the back of my mind. I fully know aliens exist. With the vastness of space and countless stars in the universe, it becomes clear to me that we cannot possibly be the only life. Even now, I can feel my heart racing as I recall the event. Did I miss out on a 1 in a billion chance to communicate with another intelligent life form? I only have one regret in my life, and that regret is not going back to find out for sure what it was. If I were ever going to communicate with beings like this, we need to have love at the center of our awareness so we don't flee in fear for no reason. So yeah, as can be seen, this encounter has affected Kyle very deeply, very profoundly. But he remains firm in what he and his wife saw. As he says, "An unknown biped walked in front of us, waved and smiled. I am not crazy." I guess you could call that a gray ET, but even among grays, there's a huge variation of descriptions. What I found super interesting about the humanoid in that case is that the witness described this figure as having very sharp, pointed teeth. That detail doesn't turn up a lot, but a number of people who have seen grays and seen inside their mouths have described exactly that. So I found that a particularly interesting detail. All of these cases have, again, more questions than answers. Again, this is why I do this research, looking for answers, trying to figure out, are these ETs? Are we being visited? I think so, but again, I'm just presenting these cases as objectively, as factually as possible, so you can make up your own minds about it. And now let's move to the final case. This one was also really profound. I just found this one so interesting. The witnesses were clearly sincere, clearly very emotionally impacted by what they saw, and I think you'll find it a particularly compelling account. I call this one, "I Made Eye Contact." This one occurred on the evening of August 25, 2017, out in the New Mexico desert, along a remote highway near the small town of Nageezi. We've got the exact location of this encounter, which I think always is interesting to see. But wow, the description of these ETs by the witness is very detailed. So I think you'll find it super interesting. The witnesses in this case were so impressed by what happened to them that they reported their case about 2 months after it occurred, but only on the condition of full anonymity. They're a couple in their mid-60s. The husband is a disabled veteran with heart issues, and he says it was around 8 p.m. on August 25, 2017, that they were driving a 37-foot diesel pusher motorhome heading at about 60 miles per hour southeast on Highway 550. This is just a few miles south of Nageezi, New Mexico, and you can see the exact location here. Suddenly they saw a flash of light coming from the left-hand side of the road ahead of them, and looking at the source, they got an incredible shock. A very brightly lit craft was hovering at eye level from their position in their motorhome, right along the left side of the highway, about 80 feet ahead of them. And inside the craft, through what appeared to be an open window, with no glass or plastic visible, two creatures sat side by side, 2 feet apart. They could only see the front of the craft. The floor, the ceiling, and the panel behind the creatures glowed with intensely bright white light. They could see what looked like a small pole rising up from the floor in front of the beings, supporting what appeared to be a sort of control panel about the size of a carton of cigarettes. The being on the left was resting his gopher-looking hand, is how the witness described it, on this control panel. And he provided a drawing of what he says the ETs looked very much like. And as the male witness says, both individuals had a skin tone about the same as mine. I am a white male. They had large heads in an upside-down tear shape, very large black eyes, a small mouth, and 2 small holes for a nose. There were holes for the ears, but only a nub for the ears. The one on the right had a very smooth face. The one on the left appeared to be older with facial lines. Their bodies were skinny and were illuminated with a greenish glowing uniform. There were roll-type cuffs that also glowed, but were beige. The arms and torso were slender and about the diameter of a very small child of 6 or 7 years of age, long and skinny, and appeared to be weak. They reminded me of stick people. One detail that the witness reiterated was the hands of the beings reminded him of the hands of gophers, with claws that could be used as a lethal weapon if necessary. It appeared to him that while their bodies looked weak, the uniforms provided some strength to their body, but really it was their eyes which impressed him the most. As he says, my first thought was, is this real? The closer we got, the more positive I was that what I was seeing was real, when I made eye contact. They were talking when we interrupted them. The one on my left wrinkled the right side of his mouth when he saw me. I made eye contact with the one on my left, and I looked directly into his large black eyes. His eye was the finest surface I have ever seen. The eye had no abrasions or scratches, no dust or mucus. I noticed that under the surface of this perfectly clear outer surface of the eye was a grid of many individual eyes, like a fly's eye, but much smoother, like a superfine glass surface. Another thing that impressed the witness was the wall behind these creatures, which he said was very hard to explain, but he tried. As the witness says, the wall was very brightly illuminated. It appeared to be divided into about 18-inch cubes, but it was a flat surface. The light seemed to be boiling along the edges of each panel in the colors of light green, blue, and violet. The power heaved with its changes, it seemed. The back panel was incredibly beautiful and something I'll never forget. Now the light was too bright for him to see the outer shape of the craft, but the strangest part was that there did not appear to be any windshield at all. As they drove up alongside this craft, the witness's hearing aids started screeching, and as he says, I felt I heard them communicating when we approached. As the witness says, the moment I saw them, the individuals were looking down the road, as if looking for something to arrive. There was a truck coming up the hill towards us, about 1/8 of a mile away. The craft seemed to swing and rotate from the shoulder on the other side to a lane away, and was at my side and maybe 20 feet away. Once they rotated enough that their faces were 180 degrees to us, he saw us and disappeared. At this point, the witnesses looked behind them through their rear-view side mirrors, but the craft was no longer visible. Later, the witness examined the area where they had seen this craft and noticed that the area where the craft had been hovering looked as if it had been recently bulldozed. He's not sure if this is a factor here, but it was strange enough to mention. They finally decided to report their sighting because, as he says, I would like to know what is going on there. That one does seem to involve typical grays, if there is such a thing as a typical gray. And you can see that this was really a terrifying and difficult to process experience for both of these witnesses. One detail that really struck me is how the witness felt like there was no windshield, no glass in this window with the ETs looking out of it. I suspect that there was. It's just that they do have the ability to basically turn the walls of their craft transparent. People describe this all the time. They don't see any glass. They don't see anything. So it looks like the ETs are out there exposed to open air. Hard to say for sure, because there certainly are cases like that where humanoids will climb onto the top of a UFO or perhaps around a little balcony or rim or something along those lines. But certainly a fascinating case, and one that deserves to be more well known. So there you go, 10 cases. I'm guessing you probably haven't heard of most of these. I do like exploring these lesser known cases and occasionally exploring some that are well known. But as the number of these cases add up, it becomes increasingly difficult to deny them, to explain them away, to debunk them. We have a catalog of, tens of thousands of these kinds of cases. So it's fine if people want to remain skeptical, but I think anyone who does objective research and really takes their time to look into these cases without overlaying their own belief system on them can only come away convinced that something truly profound is happening here. I think this is a really important subject. I think the whole world would change if all of humanity could just simply accept the fact that we are not alone, because that is certainly what the evidence is showing us. So that's it for today. Thank you once again, guys. I truly appreciate you guys watching. Hope you've enjoyed this episode, perhaps learned a little bit. Until next time, keep asking those hard questions, keep searching for the truth, and keep having fun. I will see you next episode. Bye for now. Be good.